Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of The Weekend by Bernhard Schlink, translated from the German by Sean Whiteside, narrated by Jefferson Mays, and directed by Chris Thies.
Friday. Chapter 1. She got there just before 7. She'd expected to make more headway and arrive sooner by traveling in the early morning. When she hit more road construction, and yet more, she grew nervous. Would he walk through the gate? Look out for her in vain, his first reaction one of disappointment, of discouragement? The sun rose in the rearview mirror. She would rather have been driving toward it than away from it, even if it had dazzled her. She parked where she had always parked, and walked the short path to the gate as slowly as she had always walked. Everything to do with her own life she cleared from her mind, to make room for him. He always had a firm place in her mind. Not an hour passed without her wondering what he was doing right now, how he was getting on. But each time she met him, he alone existed for her. Now that his life was no longer in suspended animation, now that it was starting to move once more, he needed her full attention. The old sandstone building stood in the sun. As so often before, she was strangely moved that a building should serve such an ugly purpose and, at the same time, be so beautiful. The walls covered with Virginia creeper, field and forest green in spring and summer, yellow and red in autumn. The small towers on the corners and the large one in the middle, its windows like those of a church, the heavy gate, forbidding, as if it wished not to shut the inhabitants in, but to shut their enemies out. She looked at the clock. The people in there liked to keep you waiting. She had often applied in vain for a 2-hour visit, and after the hour granted was simply not collected, but went on sitting with him for another half-hour, 3/4 of an hour, without really being with him any longer. But when the bells of the nearby church began to strike 7, the gate opened, and he stepped out and blinked into the sun. She crossed the street and embraced him. She embraced him before he could set down his 2 big bags, and he stood in her embrace without returning it. "At last," she said. "At last." "Let me drive," he said as they stood by the car. "I've dreamed of it so many times." "Are you sure? Cars have got faster. The traffic's heavier." He insisted, and kept driving even when the sweat stood out on his brow. She sat tensely next to him, and said nothing when he made mistakes turning in the city and overtaking on the Autobahn, until they passed a sign for a service station, and she said, "I need some breakfast. I've been up for 5 hours." She had visited him in prison every 2 weeks. But when he walked along the counter with her, filled his tray, stood at the till, came back from the toilet and sat down facing her, she felt as if she were seeing him for the first time in ages. She saw how old he had become, older than she had noticed or admitted during her visits. At first glance, he was still a handsome man, tall, square face, bright green eyes, thick salt and pepper hair. But his poor posture emphasized his little paunch, which didn't match his thin arms and legs. His gait was slow, his face gray, and the wrinkles that crisscrossed his forehead and were steep and long in his cheeks indicated not concentration so much as a vague sense of strain. And when he spoke, she was startled by the awkwardness and hesitancy with which he responded to what she said, and the random, jittery hand movements with which he emphasized his words. How could she have failed to notice that on her visits? What else was happening in him and to him that she had also failed to notice? "Are we going to your place?" "We're going to the country for the weekend. Margareta and I have bought a house in Brandenburg. Run down, no heating, no electricity, and the only water comes from the pump outside. But it's got a big old park. It's gorgeous now in the summer." "How do you cook?" She laughed. "Are you interested in that? With great fat red gas canisters. I've organized an extra 2 for the weekend. I've invited our old friends."